Hi, I'm Rebecca Barnes. I'm the Associate for Environmental Ministries in the Presbyterian Church. Environmental Ministries is part of the Hunger Program, where we work on root causes of hunger and poverty and various intersecting socioeconomic and environmental justice issues. So this is an umbrella program that does everything from farm worker and food justice to lifestyle simplicity and dealing with our partners around the world on extractive industries and seed patenting and so forth. So this webinar is specific about earth care and liturgy, earth honoring liturgies, and we have some really wonderful presenters, ecumenical panelists that will show you some really fabulous examples. I just wanted to introduce this from a PCUSA perspective to say that since 1990, though we've had environmental things going back for decades before that, we really passed a policy that emphasized how this element of caring for God's creation is really to be incorporated into our entire church life, and that includes worship, that we start paying attention to the scriptures, to the theology, and to our traditional experiences that point to care of God's creation and our place within it. The Presbyterian Church certifies earth care congregations. We have about 155 right now who get certified every year, incorporating earth care into worship, education, facilities, and outreach. So really trying to put this into all facets of their church life. And some of those earth care congregations you can find on the PCSA website, but Ashley, who will be our moderator, is representing one of our earth care churches in D.C. So I want to turn it over to Ashley, who's very graciously agreed to moderate this panel and to introduce the rest of our fabulous presenters. And welcome to all those listening and to the presenters.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So we're going to start off in a few minutes with Brandon from the United Church of Santa Fe in New Mexico. So he's our desert voice today on the panel. And then we'll hear from Anna, who is literally planting a church in San Pedro, California. So Anna is starting her own garden church. Then we'll hear from Abby, who is the Faith Community Liaison at Puente de la Costa Sur in California, and she's been doing a lot of work around liturgy and earth care. Oh, I skipped Winnie, I'm sorry. And before Abby, we'll have Winnie, who's the rector at St. Mark's in the Bowery and about ready to get bombarded by a whole lot of snow. So look forward to hearing from each person. And so we're here just to hear stories of liturgy, the work of the people, and our revolutionary earth care faith. So we hope our stories inspire you in your own local context in how to create liturgies that express restoration of the planet. So you'll see that context really matters in each story that's about to be shared. And we're not sharing as this is what you need to do, or this is exactly how it needs to happen to have liturgy and earth care, but we're hoping that your own creativity gets inspired by our stories, and your own courage and risk-taking is also inspired. So for the next hour, we just invite you to suspend that inner critic that says, oh, I wouldn't be able to do that, or my people aren't ready. So just be open to the stories and be ready for your own ideas to come forth. So Brandon, we'll start with you.
Great. Oh. Sorry, give me yes. All right, so I'm the Associate Minister at the United Church of Santa Fe in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a place where water is scarce, but the opportunities for community engagement are plentiful. So this is the entrance to the United Church of Santa Fe, and over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about the ways in which space and liturgy can inform our mission and ministry in the wider community. And so, as I said, water is a pretty scarce resource in the high desert in which the United Church of Santa Fe is situated. So this is our sanctuary. In it you will see themes of water and themes that draw on the desert that surrounds us. So on the left side of your screen you will see a representation of an acequia, which in northern New Mexico is the way in which water is brought into farming communities and other smaller rural communities. You will also see a passive solar wall, which serves many functions. One, a reminder of the adobe architecture that's situated in the area, but also it serves to heat our sanctuary in the wintertime and helps keep it cool in the summertime. We do not use air conditioning in our sanctuary during the year. We have to use a heater for part of it, but that is our space. It's reminders of water and reminders of northern New Mexico. Also, in our sanctuary space, you will see an attempt to draw in the beauty that surrounds us. This is the choir loft, in which it's surrounded by windows that remind us of the mountains and the images of the desert. So constantly during our worship experience, we try to draw on those images. So we're not isolated from the world, but instead surrounded by the beauty that is part of what we believe is part of our area. And just to give you an idea of some of the worship experiences, this fall we recognized the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, which was passed in 1964. So that worship service was a way to celebrate the protection of the wilderness around us. And so during that worship experience, we retold the story of Genesis, and during that we invited the members of the congregation to be a part of that creation experience. So a number of people put on the ears and representations of animals. Some people were plants, and so dressed in green. Others were the wind. But it was a creative way to remind ourselves of not only a powerful government act, but the ways in which creation needs to be protected and a part of who we are. Also, I'll take a minute to talk about the ways in which we draw upon the images of water and baptism. And so on the screen in front of you, I have one of the questions that we ask during our ritual of baptism. A couple of years ago, we went through a revitalization of our baptismal liturgy and decided that not only did we need to bless the water, but we needed to remind people of the sacred nature of all water and remind them that they're called to care for that very precious resource within the high desert. And so this is a question that we ask of the congregation, inviting them to recommit themselves to the wise use of this most sacred resource going out into the world. And then from that, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes moving out to how that liturgy affects the ways in which we encounter our world. So it was in 2011 in which we figured out that Good Friday was intersecting with Earth Care Day. And so on Good Friday, we decided to do a pilgrimage around our neighborhood and clean up the arroyos and acequias that mark our neighborhood and commit ourselves to cleaning that up, to cleaning up the neighborhood, and then did a series of actions along the way. And so you can see the liturgy there on the left side of your screen in terms of one of the prayers we did along the way, asking God to guide our steps, our actions, and our thoughts, but also keeping creation and water at the center of that. Also, another way in which that beauty that we surround ourselves in worship influences what we do in the wider world. Any service or learning trip we take our youth on, we make sure to build in love of creation. And so each year, one of the trips we take, it goes to the Navajo Nation in Arizona, and our Navajo partners and guides take our kids on hikes in the area. Which is great, which pushes our youth in all kinds of ways, but also reminds them of the sacred nature and beauty, and is informed by some of our native partners in the region. Also, I'll move through this quickly, but another aspect to what we do is what we call praying in the dirt. During the summer, the kids learn about our community garden and help us plant things in that garden, and literally start each session by sticking their hands in the dirt and praying with that dirt and over that dirt. And then in turn, that dirt is then taken into the fruits of that dirt are taken into the community, served at our homeless shelters and other areas to provide healthy food for the community. But the other ways in which that worship and that experience of beauty is informed or is taken out into the community is through a legislative advocacy day. Santa Fe is situated in the state capitol, and so once a year during the legislative session, our community members meet with senators and representatives to talk about our faith and our care for creation. And so there you see Larry Rasmussen, who is a member of our congregation and also author of Earth Honoring Faith, waiting to meet with some of our state senators in the state capitol. And he's wearing a shirt that says, "Love God, love neighbor, and love creation." The other ways that this is informed in our community work, or informs our community work, is on the south side of Santa Fe, which is technically classified as a food desert and an underserved area and population. And so our community members work with our partners on that side to gain access to healthy foods, to make sure some of the fruits of our garden are distributed on that side, but also that we begin to align our resources to better help those on the south side of Santa Fe. But that all comes from a very rich understanding of worship and the ways we organize our space and organize our liturgy. And so that's an image of the Presbyterian Retreat Center Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. Just wanted to leave you all with that. All right, Anna, I'm done. I'll pass it on to you.
Great, thank you. It's so inspiring to see pictures of what other people are doing around the country. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Anna Wiffenden. I'm the pastor and founder of the Garden Church, which is this brandy new church plant in Los Angeles area in California. And this topic of liturgy and earth care is my total geek out area. So when I was asked to be part of this panel, I got very excited and started to think about, well, where do we even start? Because this is actually like, these are the two things that we do at the Garden Church. We are a church that is a garden and a garden that's a church. And we're constantly looking at this question of how do we be a church in the world and how do we be an environmentally aware and outdoor community hub. So the Garden Church is reimagining church as an interconnected organism, worshiping, loving, and serving together as we transform a plot of land into a vibrant urban garden. And this is literally a brand new church start. We're started on September 1st, and this comes out of a long-term dream of mine to reimagine church around food and gardening and to take liturgy outdoors, really coming from this growing conviction and observation that our culture is becoming more and more disconnected from nature, disconnected from our food, disconnected from each other, and disconnected from God. And so the Garden Church, the vision of the Garden Church really comes as being a canvas or a playground that I see the garden and the outdoor space that we're looking to create as a place to play with what does it mean to be church? What does it mean to worship? What does it mean to be spiritual community together? And what does it mean to really look at feeding people in body and mind and spirit? So we're reimagining church literally without walls, outdoors, and we're really looking to redefine and continue to ask the question of what does it mean to be church together and to live our motto, which is to feed and be fed, to feed people in body, mind, and spirit. So our long-term vision, which is still a sketch, I hope to have different pictures to offer you in a couple of years, but our long-term vision is to find a plot of land, which we're actively in the process of searching for and tracking down here in San Pedro, and to create an outdoor worship space, an urban hub, urban sanctuary, a community hub, and what we're calling it a communal garden rather than a community garden, in that often in a community garden everyone has a bed, whereas in a communal garden, as we're defining it, everyone has something to do and everyone can harvest from it, so that anyone who walks through our gate can engage in community and engage in the work of growing food and also engage in being able to receive food. We're looking to plant in a food desert area. One of the reasons we're in this area of town is there are physical food needs as well as certainly spiritual and communal food needs. So we're looking to create a place where people can come together and be church in different ways. And so we're starting that right now. We are being church whenever we meet, and we're primarily currently meeting in public parks. And as a church, we always do three things. We work together, and that can be working in some of our partner gardens, done park cleanups, all sorts of pieces. And again, long term, that will look many different ways, but primarily be working in the earth together and growing and providing food together. And then we worship together. And it has been such a profound experience personally to experience doing liturgy outdoors. We do what we might think of as somewhat a rather traditional liturgy. We have your basic invocation and your prayers and readings and sermons and all those pieces that you might think of as a typical worship service. But something changes, I'm finding, when you take it outside and you're surrounded by the birds and you stop and are silent and listen to the sounds that are coming by and feel the earth beneath your feet and see the people that are with you. And so we've worshipped on the beach, we've worshipped in public parks, we worship at the garden where we're working, and continue to point to what does it mean to be church together. Because we're a church on the move and because we don't have these external marker points, we, every time we meet, unpack what we call our tabernacle, which harkens back to the children of Israel when they wandered through the desert. Whenever they camped, they'd set up their tabernacles, remember God's dwelling place with them. And so we always set up our tabernacle, and so wherever we are, remember that God is dwelling with us, and that's a really core liturgical and theological principle that we are operating on, is that God is everywhere and in all things and moving and present, and the power of us coming together in community and liturgy is to be able to name that. We always conclude the worship part of our gathering with communion. We call it sacred meal, and then we move straight from the sacred meal into our community meal. Right now, this is often just like a big shared picnic. Long term, we have visions of having this be a large community meal that's available for anyone who's hungry at 6 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. And so so we are just having a blast experimenting with what it really can mean to engage church or worship, these things that we think of in many different more traditional forms, in these outdoor settings. And I'll just close by telling you a story about what this picture is about. We had church on the beach the other day, and for the sermon, we read the scriptures, and then I framed it, gave a little frame, and then said, now we're just going to sit and we're going to listen to the still small voice and listen to the waves. And this young woman came up to me afterwards in tears and said, I've been going to church all my life, and I always go and people tell me about God, but she said, today I realized that God really is accessible and available everywhere, because I heard God as we were listening to the ocean, and I felt God as we were gathered together in community. And so that's what keeps me going and exploring and really engaging this question of this interconnected web, because I think there's something that's really profound and powerful when we do this mashup and take these liturgical principles that we're used to doing indoors and take them outdoors and see that God is present in nature and present in each other. So that's what I've got, and we'll pass it over to Winnie.
Hello? I think I just lost.
Nope, we can still hear you.
Oh, there it is. Great. Hi, I might be at the far extreme of what we've heard so far. This is St. Mark's in the Bowery in New York City. We are in the East Village. You would be hard-pressed to say that there is much that is organic and beautiful unless you are a history buff about the site that St. Mark's in the Bowery has sat on since 1795. We are the neighborhood that Rent tells the story of. We are a city church that has experienced probably 25 to 30 years of gentrification. We were at the heart of the crack epidemic in this nation. I came to St. Mark's 5 years ago thinking that we were stewards at St. Mark's of more of a building and a site than we could imagine what to do with it, so we should stick to the work that we knew how to do, which was worship and the pursuit of justice. But you couldn't kind of get around the fact that we have 2 yards that are a full city block that are ours. A rector of St. Mark's in the early 60s was reported to have said, when asked if he would be planting grass in the east yard, which is the yard that you can see on the right of the screen, that it would be a folly to plant grass while the city was burning. So there is some green at St. Mark's. This is our west yard, and this is the congregation that has begun to develop since 2009. It is young, it is diverse, it is energetic, but we still have much more scope of land to care for and building to care for than you could imagine for 30 or 60 or 100 or even 300 people. So we started to use the space by actually just sitting in it and entertaining ourselves in it to begin to love it and maybe to not be as intimidated as we had been. This is the east yard where the grass was not planted. So we have pretty trees, but as you can see, we look out over 11th Street and 2nd Avenue, and then south of this image, 10th Street as well. And it's all of our responsibility. We technically own it, but it's an enormous piece of land. And the first couple of days I was there, and for years afterwards, there were needles to pick up. There was all kinds of waste, human waste, animal waste. It felt like a no-go zone, and really intimidating day after day for the staff and for the members of the church. It was almost impossible to imagine how we could create some kind of good that was sustainable and that wouldn't be harmed by the neighborhood or become vulnerable in some way. So the first thing we did, and it took us 4 years, was to go through this east yard of ours and pick out, as well as we could, needles and shards and all kinds of things that we didn't really want to touch and lay down a labyrinth. Seemed like a really silly idea when we started to do it because we're not a labyrinthy kind of neighborhood. We're a very urban, diverse, and struggling neighborhood in many ways. But we found an image of a very modified, simplified labyrinth that fit over the gravestones that we have in the yard, that both of our yards sit on top of vaults. And we happened to find one that if we turned and turned and turned could accommodate a pattern within, or could create a pattern within the grave markers that we had. It took us quite a while to get all the garbage out of the yard and then to till the yard. We have some knee splints and braces to show for the work, and then to lay out a labyrinth in mulch and in stone. And I think it seemed like a folly as we were doing it, but as we finished it, I think we became aware as a congregation that we might have more capacity to affect our site than we had imagined. We are a very justice-seeking, bold, Episcopal church in the city. We're a very unusual Episcopal church in the city, but we were intimidated and continue to be in some ways by our heritage and what we find ourselves responsible for. So in response to having laid down this labyrinth and work like that, we found ourselves looking for something to do for Good Friday in 2014. And I had read early in the year that there was a plan from Washington to put crosses in yards all over the church, all kinds of churches, not just Episcopal churches, to symbolize people whose lives have been lost by gun violence in the country. I assumed, as a good priest, that everybody was going to do it because we had all been told to do it. We got closer to Holy Week, and I couldn't find any reference that anyone had done it yet. So with Rob, our senior warden, we went out and bought bamboo, and he brought out a saw, and we started to cut it to make crosses to try to figure out how to be faithful to what we thought a lot of other people were going to do. But from what I can tell, we might have been alone in thinking that this is what everybody was doing for this week. So this is us, and this is just 7 people all together, if you count these guys and me and Rob, putting together these crosses with zip ties and bamboo that you would buy in a garden supply store. It became this really powerful meditation for us as a community to be making crosses the week before Holy Week. We hadn't anticipated the power of building crosses, and we discussed it as we were making them. And then we were supposed to put T-shirts on these crosses once they were made and tell the story of people that had been killed in New York. That was our plan. We found, again, as we were doing this preparation, that it was very hard to get the names of all the people that had been killed in New York with a gun, and it was hard to find their stories. So we found ourselves having a week of intense meditation that we had not planned on the lives of people who had been killed with a gun and who they were and what their stories were, that we had not, again, anticipated because of the research necessary to create this project, which ultimately had been about, or had begun with, becoming a witness to a political issue in the city, which is what we know how to do, and using our yards to frame this story. So we started our Palm Sunday service by going out into the street. This is us on 2nd Avenue. We took our palms and we processed down to Middle Church, and we kind of crashed their service with them and had a flash mob singing fest for a little while. And then we came back down 2nd Avenue on Palm Sunday morning. And after the service, we picked up these crosses in the back of the church, and we picked up the T-shirts that we had all been making, and we went out to our east yard, which had been desolate, and we planted these crosses. And this is what it looked like from the window of my office. So you can see that 2nd Avenue in Manhattan, that's 10th Street. We found that people covered it. It was on Twitter, it was on our local blogs, it was in the diocesan paper, it was in all the social media that relates directly to the East Village. It became a powerful witness of something much larger than we had thought we could do, and it was eerie. It looked like a bunch of scarecrows out in the yard. And one of the things we learned from having this out in public like this, which was scary for all of us, was that our yards are actually not as vulnerable as we think they are. No one touched this display, which was very provocative, and included a sign out front that said people are killed with guns. People took pictures and they documented it, but no one came in and messed with it, which is our story of our yards, that they're vulnerable to people that just harass us or want to trash the yards. And we learned actually that when the yards are filled with something that is respected, that actually isn't the case. And we found that we created a way to create a public witness for the building that reflected our values as a church. In response to that, this last September, on Labor Day, we had these folks, which are members of our congregation. As one of our parishioners said, 6 years ago, this would have been enough people to have the Eucharist. It would have been the entire congregation. This is about 1/10 of us out there digging out all the last rocks and needles and spoons and waste in the yard, filling the yard with compost and planting prairie seed. Prairie seed because it will begin to create networks of roots that will replenish the soil and prevent erosion, and actually have the earth do the work that the earth knows how to do in its own restoration, which in some ways is also the story of the restoration and rebuilding of our congregation. And then we were worried last year and this year that having done these crosses and having done such an exciting thing out in our yard, that we wouldn't know what to do this year to replicate it. So we've made all kinds of plans for what would come next, and we were scheming about where the crosses go and what could be as provocative. And we were reminded this fall and this winter that you don't have to look necessarily for the Holy Spirit in action. She comes. So when the movement to make the nation aware of who is vulnerable to police violence started to gain traction, the day after the Ferguson decision, our congregation got together and made this banner, which was stolen that night, but it was out for about 10 hours. And was us loving our site and using it for the witness that it can be. And I think, as I'd like to believe, we began to model, as we started to learn to care for this earth, that we could not imagine we could be appropriate stewards for. That's my story from St. Mark's. Abby, I think you're next.
Great. Let me get my screen. So I don't serve a church. I serve a nonprofit, and I'm going to talk about how we do liturgy on the south coast of Northern California with a nonprofit called Puente de la Costa Sur and the community of the South Coast. If I can get the screen to work. So Puente started in 1998 with our founder, Wendy Taylor, sitting on the steps of the Pescadero Community Church and talking to farm workers as they were going to the store to get food for the week. And Pescadero is a bit of a food desert, even though it's surrounded by farms worked by farm workers. And so Wendy started having conversations with these farm workers and discovered that they didn't have a lot of community, and they had a lot of needs that weren't being met. And so Puente started out of the back of Pescadero Community Church. And then in time, Puente expanded to serve the entire community to provide safety net services and cradle-to-grave services for 2,000 people in a 160 square mile area. And my job as the faith community liaison is to connect communities of faith to the work that Puente does. And a lot of my work is around bringing this picture to life. Let me see if I can bring it up. So remembering that every time that we give thanks to God for our food, that there are other people who are preparing that food for us. And so there's some theological and social assumptions that I'm making about the work that I'm doing. And the first is that theology as a whole is inherently ecological. And by that I mean that it's relational, that it's a reminder that we are connected to each other and to God and to the earth. And so anything that we do at Puente that's relational is theological and also ecological. And then I'm also operating under the assumption that liturgy is the work of the people. And so while Puente has a pretty large staff, it's also really connected to the community and to the work of the people. And we try to listen to what they need. And so recently we celebrated Christmas with the farm workers that participate in one of our programs. And every other year we've spent a lot of time packing bags with things that we think that they need. And this year we got out all the things we thought they needed and made kind of a modified store and gave each of the farm workers a bin and said, you know, here's what we think you might need, but please take what you actually do need. And it was so interesting to see what they actually took. One of my favorite stories is when they were looking at the deodorant and the men all said, this deodorant isn't for us, it's for women. And so I learned a lot about what assumptions I'd been making and what they actually needed. But then the other thing that informs our work is how we create respect and dignity for people who are so often lumped into the category of the very least of these, and farm workers and children and people who are poor. And so we do a lot of work to make sure that they are protected and that they are empowered to do the work that they need to do. But there are a couple things that we do that looks a lot like liturgy. And the first is a really deep desire to be hospitable. And so everything that we do has really specific and abundant welcome. And we try to do that with a lot of joy. And so we're always, to come to Puente means that you often have to drive. If you don't live in the community, you have to drive at least 30 minutes. And so we always have tea and water and lots of good food. But then we also encourage other people to welcome each other. And so these are 3 of our youngest volunteers with their welcome sign for the beginning of our backpack project. And then we have kind of married agricultural season to the liturgical season, and I just want to highlight 2 things. The first is Dia de los Muertos, which is the Mexican traditional holiday of the Day of the Dead, where we recognize that the veil is thin between the living and the dead, and we mourn the people we've lost. And for many of the people that we work with in Pescadero, they're mourning people they've loved from far away. It's very difficult to return to Mexico for many of the people we work with, and so they're mourning in a country that is not their own. And we do this celebration and observance on our last farmers market. And so it's a time where we acknowledge the ending. And that picture on the left is of some of the local farmers dressed as skeletons. And then on the right is an image from Posada, where it's every December, we celebrate and remember when Mary and Joseph, in the story from the Bible, looked for a place of welcome in an inn. And we as a community process through Pescadero looking for welcome. And then we end with, there's singing and prayers throughout the event, and then we end with a meal and Santa. And a lot of our work is not just about cultivating hospitality, but also cultivating joy. And if I had more time, I would tell you about Homework Club, where we have a pattern of how we do everything, and that picture on the bottom is a much beloved photo that the kids staged and they want to see all the time. And Homework Club has become a safe place for a lot of the kids as they learn to understand that they matter, that they're loved, and that they have the potential to do really well in school. And then the picture on the right is me right before our 5K that we do, and that's what I'm wearing when I'm not wearing my clerical collar. There's this weird interaction that I have with a lot of the community, where often they just see me in these kinds of clothing, and then they remember that I'm the pastor for Puente, and it leads to really good, healthy conversations about connecting who we are as people who are growing food to people who are for people who are feeding others, and to do that with joy. But I also just want to end with one story from Homework Club. A couple days ago, we were sitting in a circle reading Corduroy, which is a great book about a little bear looking for someone to take him home. And at the very end, Corduroy says to Lisa, his new person, I think I've always wanted a home. And Stevie, one of the 3-year-olds in the group, broke into the middle of the story and said, everyone does, everyone. And when Stevie said that, it reminded me of the truth that we all kind of search for, that we want to know that we belong to a place and to each other, and that the work that I do liturgically and theologically is about making Pescadero and the South Coast a sacred place for the people that we work with. And this is just a little bit more and extra resources.
Thanks, Abby. So this is Ashley Goff. I'm Ashley, and I'm from Church of the Pilgrims in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to show you some of the things that we have done in relationship to liturgy and earth-honoring faith. Okay, so on Labor Day a few years ago was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and I preached on MLK and the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis. I took the giant glass bowl off our baptism pedestal and put it on a trash can that I spray painted "I am a man," the mantra of the sanitation workers in Memphis. I filled the font with garbage and sunflowers. And I shared the idea during the service that everything is sacred and everything is garbage. And what we do with our garbage is a labor issue and a value statement. We followed up that fall with a series on food and faith, and we had communion every Sunday from September through November. We focused on 3 parts: compost, lament, and harvest. Compost as our essence, our biblical nature, of from soil we've come and to soil we shall return. Lament in order to really grieve the horrific, toxic state of the planet. And harvest is an experience of community and growth. So this was our first communion table. So we took plexiglass legs, filled them with compost, and put a barn door type on top for the table. The next week, I took a wheelbarrow and filled it with veggie scraps, the initial stage of compost, and this is the first things that folks saw when they came into the sanctuary. Then I filled the font with decomposing food plus a little bit of finished compost, and this was, in essence, the second stage of the compost process. Then we took away the table, all our furniture, and we created a communion table out of compost. So this is the final stage, finished compost. So as you walked into the sanctuary, between wheelbarrow, font, and table, you saw the stages of death to life and life to death. So this is the view of the table from a different angle. So we sat on the floor and shared in communion each week. And we sat because I didn't want the posture of us standing over the microphone, or standing over the compost, excuse me, and kind of lording over it, but sitting on the floor, which felt much more relational. So at the end of our Food and Faith series, we created an at-table service where we dragged tables and chairs into the sanctuary and had a meal of harvest foods. So this is a picture from our old pulpit. We also have in our sanctuary stations for kids, and kids can go to these stations throughout any point in the service, engaging in liturgical principles and values at their own developmental level. So this is our storytelling station, which includes lots of books on Native Americans and land. This is a felt board that focuses a lot on the creation story. We have a station about worship as a way of helping us see things differently, and this station involves a lot of color. We have binoculars, magnifying glasses, kind of meditative lava lamps, and books on how you can see your city through shadow and light and color. So we also have a station about making connections, and this involves a sand table for quiet movement and magnetic things, which is the energy force of the planet. So last Palm Sunday, we processed around our neighborhood with our echo palms and our homemade umbrellas and streamers. We wanted to parade around our neighborhood like a New Orleans jazz funeral. So we processed around our closest park and traffic circle, and we held signs that proclaimed our values, including eat local, grow a garden, and here, the middle sign, clean water, and then there's a cute little picture of a honeybee to the left. So on Maundy, Thursday, that same Holy Week, we took our passion story into our urban garden. We put up lanterns and candles and a fire pit with our cross. It was 40 degrees and dark, where we heard the end of Jesus' life. And then after Easter, we had to reinstall honeybees into our honeybee hives, which are part of our urban garden, since the polar vortex killed all of our honeybees in all 4 of our hives. So here, Andy, one of our members, gets milk and honey ready for our liturgy of welcoming the bees. So since all the bees died last winter, we also incorporated honeycomb from the hives and dead bees, so we can be really clear about what happens with such extreme weathers. So this is the Sunday where we blessed our plants to go into the garden. We filled up our little plastic communion cups that we rarely use. We filled those up with water from the font, and then we watered the plants with water from the font and shared our hopes and dreams from the garden. So this is just another angle of the plants, and you can see the little communion cups down to the right. So last year, some of our neighbors across the street, who are part of a Jewish community, built a sukkah for Sukkot in our garden. And we used the sukkah at the end of a baptism service this past fall, where we ended not only with our coffee hour, but we ended the liturgy itself to recognize vulnerability and community and harvest and impermanence and the need for permanent housing for so many in Washington, D.C. Then during Advent, we made ornaments with the words Black Lives Matter and hung them as part of our worship service the 3rd Sunday of Advent on trees outside our building. This was part of a public arts endeavor in D.C. and several cities across the country. So this is a close-up of one of the ornaments. So also throughout the past couple of years, we've started doing a winter solstice and a summer solstice service. Both focus upon tying our lives to the cycle of the sun and moon, light and darkness. We use compost a lot in both services, but it's definitely a time of weaving ourselves around the cycle of creation that was given to us in the beginning. So that's all of our presenters. So now we're going to go to question and answers. So just a reminder just to type in your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So go ahead and ask away. We have one question. This is directed to Anna from Alan in Atlanta, and Alan wants to know, Anna, where did you get any startup funding? And if so, where were you able to find some funding?
The funding question. We don't have any one chunk of startup funding. We're doing a 5-pronged funding approach, doing a lot of our own fundraising. We've established a board early on. I established a nationwide hand-picked board, and so we've been working to establish our funding strategy since last March. And we have some denominational support, but it's primarily at this point actually been through what we're calling our cultivation team, which is individuals all over the country who believe in this startup. And so anywhere from people giving $10 a month to some angel investors. And that's been really amazing just to see that people want to try to get something new and creative off the ground. And then we have a whole local funding strategy that I could get into, or it's on our website. But the answer is no. There wasn't one big pot. We're doing it from literally the ground up, and really amazed at the abundance and of people wanting to be involved. I'm grateful for that.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have another question from Lois. She says, I live in the southern portion of the Midwest surrounded by climate deniers, and where sometimes sustainability and ecology are considered liberal mumbo jumbo. Community gardens are about as far as we go with earth care. Any suggestions? Brandon, you want to take a shot at that one?
Sure, I'll take a shot initially, but then I would like others to jump in. What we found and I can only speak to our context, is that we start with getting people outdoors, and whether it's on hikes, whether it's on walks, whatever it is, to see the beauty that needs to be protected and lived with. I think community gardens are a good way to start, but just getting people outdoors. I remember Larry Rasmussen once saying during a sermon, you cannot say what you do not love. And so teaching people to really love the earth, I find, is a way to do that, and is an easy, careful way to bring some more conservative-minded folks into that conversation, because I think we all like being outdoors. And so, yeah, so I would just say, starting with hikes, getting people outdoors, getting people to love that space is really important. Anybody else want to jump in?
This is Abby, and one of the books that I really love in this venue is a book called A Climate for Change. Catherine Hayhoe is one of the authors, and she wrote it with her husband, who's a conservative Christian, and they have very different ideas about faith and also about science, but I think it's a really helpful book to kind of start that conversation.
There was a question from Emmett in Bellingham for Winnie specifically, but Emmett, your question didn't come through. So if you're still with us, if you could just resubmit that question, that would be great. Winnie, do you want to take a shot at least, or do you want to answer the mumbo jumbo question?
Yeah, in some ways I come from the other end of the mumbo jumbo. My progressive church would say, while the city is burning, how dare we play around in the dirt? And that this is for people that have a lot more recreation and don't live in our neighborhood. And there's a lot of writing on this, but my experience is in our community that immigrant communities in our neighborhood are not that far from farmers. We're a generation or two connected to the earth, and speak quite clearly to how healing having our hands in the soil is. And in the part of Texas I grew up in, having a garden and having beautiful flowers didn't have anything to do with our politics, but beauty and what is sacred, I think, is a fairly easy connection to make that I think, as someone else has said, can't help but open your heart to love for the earth, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Abby, there was a question about the name of the book. Can you share the name of that book again?
The book that I suggested for the Midwest,
yeah.
It's called A Climate for Change by Catherine Hayhoe.
Okay, thanks. That's a question. Let's see. I'm scrolling these. All right, so there's a question For me, what are the 3 stages, metaphors you mentioned earlier in your presentation that you brought into worship and communion? The 3 stages were compost, lament, and harvest. So we spent about 3 or 4 weeks on each of those stages with the idea that we start with compost because that's how we began in our biblical essence. And then we move to lament as a way of really getting at kind of embodying and embracing and naming and calling out the real horrific state of the planet, and knowing that you have, using the psalmist kind of model, that you have to go through lament as a process in order to really advocate for justice. And so the last one was harvest. So we were actually in harvest season in the Mid-Atlantic, so we were able to really kind of pull in that seasonal dynamic and also just really celebrate the work that we had done and also the work that was to come, and just kind of engage as a community what the reality is around us as far as what the planet is giving us as far as food. So those were the 3 stages. All right, let me see what else. Some more questions. All right, so if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask us right now. And I'm curious if any of the presenters have any questions for each other. So Anna, did a presentation from the rest of us spark something that you're curious about or wonder about in your own work?
Oh, so many things. I'd be interested to hear from Brandon a little bit more about bringing the water into liturgy and the liturgy of baptism. Something that we talk about a lot here, and we do it in our opening, is just the preciousness of water, but also linking it to that ritual. And we're focusing on the sacrament of communion on a weekly basis, but also how do you bridge and point to the elements of sacrament, and then the element, be it water or food, that's out in the broader world. So I don't know if you have any more could add to that.
Sure. I mean, I'd love to have a conversation about that. You all are so good. I deeply respect all of your work. In terms of water, we've done a number of things. One is, since we're United Church of Christ, we baptize by sprinkling. And a couple of years ago, because water is so enjoyable in the desert, in terms of the sacrament itself, now we really use quite a bit of water on babies' heads. We don't immerse them, but we use a lot more of it to show what the abundance can do and the joy in that. And also because a couple of years ago, and then I'll move on from this topic, fire and burning is such a touchy issue in the desert that on Pentecost, as fires were raging around Santa Fe, we decided not to draw on the language that is traditionally used for Pentecost and flames, but instead we decided to do a blue Pentecost, in which we drew on the more images of water and that in terms of Pentecost. I mean, we really, about 3 years ago, realized what an opportunity we have in the desert to draw on all the images of water around us, both scarcity and abundance. And the other thing we do is when we do a baptism, instead of the font being withdrawn from the congregation, it's really placed in the midst of the first 2 or 3 rows, so that water becomes a central part rather than a withdrawn part. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. Winnie, what about you? What's come up from you as you've watched these presentations? What are you feeling inspired by or curious about from the stories that you've seen?
One sort of an Episcopal response. I think I'm so inspired by how creative and how much flexibility all of you are expressing in how you develop liturgy. That's something that it's always a stretch for me, I think, within my tradition, and so moving to hear about. I mean, the idea of using water for Pentecost or blue for Pentecost, or even a blue flame, just blows my mind. So I'm a little overwhelmed with input right now. I'm interested in this idea of a church without walls. I spend so much of my time concerned about trying to get people back in their bodies in a building and engaged with something that we own and are stewards of. And I'm really intrigued by this idea of really moving far beyond property we own and statements we can make on our property. And all of you are speaking to it in different ways, of making church in public. And I guess the question I have, I guess for all of you in some ways, is what is the impact on your community of the public witness of worshiping in public like that? Or what did you intend and what is happening?
Okay, Winnie, let's put a pause in that because someone has a specific question for you. This is from Emily Otto. Winnie, could you share a bit more about the connections between the labyrinth and the graves? Do they as symbols speak to one another, and how does the congregation recognize these connections?
So, thank you. The transition we were trying to make is that the graveyards, though we're framed by them and they're all around us, we're seen sort of as places that we shouldn't touch or could harm, but not as sites for prayer. And so the labyrinth was developed so that we could actually use the external site, which we'd sort of been hiding from, as a site for prayer, and we could have a site for prayer that wasn't defined by the Episcopal Church out in the open. So people come to visit the grave sites all the time because Peter Stuyvesant is buried there, and I guess many important or famous historic characters are there. But it was simply a tourist site, and in the midst of that, we've created an opportunity, at the very least, for stillness and contemplation, and then occasionally for active, workshop. We hope to do meditation workshops and other things outside. But the idea for us is that we have actually literally opened up the entire site to anyone who seeks stillness or quiet.
Thank you. So last call for a question for our presenters, but let's see. Winnie, do you want to put that question out there again that you asked before?
I'll do it, yeah, and more briefly, just the impact of cleaning outside, doing liturgy outside, worshiping outside. How do people in your communities talk about the impact of that on who they are and how they understand what it means to worship?
Mm-hmm. Abby, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting to talk with particularly the youth about how they connect their faith to the work that primarily their parents are doing. And it's mostly their parents who are farm workers. And a lot of them talk about faith as really this thing that is something they're forced to do and that they do by rote. And yet they're also asking questions about how Puente is so spiritual. Because it's now a secular organization and a secular nonprofit that's really spiritual, there's, I think, less worry about making sure that we fit some box. But it's been interesting to see them kind of live into what it might mean to be people of faith, not just by rote, but by being out in the world together. I don't know if that answers your question. It's because we're a secular group that is spiritual by choice. I think that's a hard question for me.
Great, thanks, Abby. So we are at our 1 o'clock time, at least 1 o'clock Eastern time. Rebecca, do you want to close the webinar?
Yes, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the panelists, and Ashley, to you for moderating. The slide showing is for more information. Hopefully people have had plenty of time to see it and write down websites, but just to reiterate, the webinar will also be made available at the PCUSA website in the first point there, and folks can rewatch it, share it around. That you're welcome to email me. I didn't put my email there, but it's Rebecca.Barnes@pcusa.org. and that a specific liturgical resource coming out soon from Creation Justice Ministries, which is the Ecumenical Roundtable, used to be the National Council of Churches Eco-Justice Program, is on food and climate and should be coming out pretty soon here and will be uploaded on the main Environmental Ministries website. So hope that this has sparked some ideas in folks and that we can continue to think, no matter what our setting or where our people are on the spectrum, that we can continue to connect God's creation in our worship and liturgical spaces. So once again, thanks to all attending as well as to all our panelists, and blessings as you go forward into this week.
Thank you.